Hey everyone, it's Last Protagonist. I recently checked out the AI Limit demo and figured I'd share some of my thoughts with you all here. I know it's a bit cliche to compare every game to Dark Souls at this point, but I'm going to have to stick to my guns and say that AI Limit feels more like an anime take on the formula of Dark Souls 1 with its slower, more deliberate action combat than an evolution on the genre, though it still has moments of fast-paced action when facing bosses. Obviously, with this being a separate game from Dark Souls, there are some notable differences, like the lack of a stamina bar, which is nice, and the inclusion of the sync rate meter, which doubles as your character's posture meter as well as their mana bar. I've got some pretty mixed feelings about this though, because while I enjoy needing to land attacks on enemies to recharge the sync meter, which will allow you to cast spells or use special skills, you'll also be able to passively deal more damage against enemies depending on how charged up your meter is. Likewise, if an enemy hits you, your sync rate will drop as well, and if your sync rate drops to 0, your stance will get broken. On one hand, this is pretty cool and encourages players to stay aggressive or to carefully pick their shots, but the trade-off of losing some passive damage on attacks as well as the risk of opening oneself up to being stance broken might inadvertently incentivize players to just stockpile their resources and interact with skills and spells as little as possible. I realize this might sound a bit too negative in a vacuum, so I should say that the sync rate does recharge to a set point based on your equipment, so it really isn't that big of a deal to use your spells or skills, but the core design is a little at odds with itself, and it's a little unintuitive knowing when to pick your shots. If I could change one thing about the current system, I'd remove the passive damage bonus for having more sync rate, so that way players wouldn't be encouraged to hold on to their resources. As for the more traditional Souls-like combat of AI limits, I must admit I was a little disappointed by how bland and clunky it felt trying to weave light attacks and heavy attacks together, and how weapon skills were nearly indistinguishable from normal attacks early on in the game. However, after clearing the demo, the boss challenge mode opened up, which gave the player access to more weapons and equipment, so I was able to see that weapon skills do become more interesting and worthwhile later on, so it's a bit unfortunate how unremarkable they are early on, which ties back into that issue of trying to figure out where and when you should use them that I mentioned earlier. I was a little baffled by this, and maybe it's because I've played a number of Soulslikes already and I'm familiar with the mechanics, but you start off the game without the ability to block or parry enemy attacks, and you need to find these upgrades later on. Maybe the devs weren't trying to overload new players to the genre with too much information, but it might also backfire by making the game seem simpler than it really is to vets like me. Because I was unused to the controls, it felt a little awkward at first, but you can also choose to switch between shielding and parrying attacks on the fly, as well as switch to a lightning dodge which costs some of your sync rate, or a blood-based damage buff which costs some of your HP later on. It's a bit of a shame these last two options were only available in the boss challenge mode though, because if players only go through the story of the demo, they may come away with the impression that the game is more basic than it really is. Speaking of the story of AI Limit, it seems to follow the traditional FromSoft formula of having a minimal amount of dialogue and trying to make up for it with item descriptions, but because I was playing the demo version of the game, a large number of these descriptions were unavailable, making the story nearly inscrutable. I was kind of surprised at myself for it, but I found myself becoming slightly annoyed at how unnecessarily cryptic the game felt, and I wondered why that was. Wasn't AI Limit just doing something similar to Dark Souls and Elden Ring? If so, why do those games get a pass, but AI Limit does not? The more I thought about it, the more I realized it came down to presentation. Maybe this is just because it's the demo, but unlike Dark Souls or Elden Ring, there were no intro cinematics for AI Limit that helped set the scene or the tone of the game. You kind of just wake up in a sewer and fight a bunch of enemies without much reason for it. Probably because they're possessed by the void. You eventually find a random NPC that talks briefly about us being a blader, the void, and branches, but these are such abstract concepts at this point in the experience that you can't really ground them to anything. Shortly afterward, you meet the equivalent of a Firekeeper lady who gives you a choice between 3 different weapon types, which is kind of annoying that you can't even test which amongst the 3 you'd actually like the best, and you're told that interacting with branches, which seems to serve as bonfires, might help you get your memories back. That's fine enough, I guess, but it's not particularly compelling, and I think the biggest difference between Dark Souls and AI Limit is how both games manage expectations. Between its intro cutscene and the Asylum Demon, Dark Souls ingrains into the player that this world doesn't owe you a thing, and that anything you take from it will come out of its cold, dead hands. You want to be a boss? Then get good or die trying, kid. Want to understand the lore? Here's 3 disconnected pieces of a puzzle. You figure out the rest. Quite frankly, AI limit isn't challenging enough to set these kinds of expectations for the player, so the way it presents its lore doesn't feel nearly as natural as a game like Dark Souls. Beyond that, there might be some cultural context lost in translation, making the game even more inscrutable than it should be. From playing Bloodborne, I could potentially see the mud referenced in AI limit kind of being like the nightmarishly arcane Grand Lake of Mud mentioned by Mikolash.
A grand lake of mud, hidden now from sight.
But that's just more of an educated guess, and when I hear that the people of AI Limit's world eat the mud, it makes me think of how Setsuko eats rice balls made out of mud engraved with the fireflies because they don't have enough food. Without knowing why, it makes the world of AI Limit feel a bit more bleak and nonsensical, or even potentially off-putting to new players. These kinds of issues aren't game-breaking by any means, but my point is, I don't think AI Limit holding its cards so close to its chest with both its lore and gameplay mechanics is going to be doing itself any favors drawing newer players into the franchise. Beyond that, I thought the level design of the sewers was surprisingly good. It was large with multiple branching paths circling back in on themselves, had a few good hidden rooms, and FromSoft quality shortcuts connecting things together. I also appreciated how you started off the game with the ability to teleport directly to your last visited branch without losing any resources, and that whenever you died, you only lost 25% of your current currency, making death suitably punishing and corpse runs a thing of the past. While the basic enemies were a bit on the easy side, probably because it was only the opening area of the game, I thought the bosses were suitably challenging, and if more bosses are going to be like the one featured in the boss challenge mode once you clear the demo, I think AI Limit could show some real promise as a slower Souls-like when the full version releases on March 27th. If you're more of a fan of the pacing of older FromSoft titles like Dark Souls 1, Demon Souls, or even the 2023 version of Lords of the Fallen, I'd recommend checking out AI Limit because it might be right up your alley. Anyway, that'll be it for me. Special thanks to all my patrons and channel members for your continued support, and you for watching until the end. Until next time, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out.